Hi there. In this business topic video, we're going to take a look at a distinction that can be made between two different approaches to decision making in a business. And the distinction is between an approach called centralisation versus decentralisation. It's an interesting debate, isn't it? Where should decision making or authority lie in a business? Should all the key decisions, in fact all decisions, be made by those at the centre, those with the most authority, passing those decisions down the hierarchy? Or should a broader range of people, employees, junior managers, have some authority and decision-making power? In other words, decentralising to some extent the decision-making in business. That issue, that debate, goes right to the heart of this distinction between centralisation and decentralisation. And as we look at this distinction, what we have to bear in mind is, where is decision making taken in a business? Who in the business has the authority to make decisions? Should it be centralised? Should it rest with the senior management, the board of directors, who are at the centre of the business? Or should there be some kind of delegation of decision making, where authority is passed down the hierarchy to more junior levels of management, maybe even all the way down to the shop floor? In other words, decision making is to some extent decentralised. Centralised decision making is perhaps the traditional approach to authority. And what happens with the centralised structure is that, if you imagine the hierarchy of the business, the organisational hierarchy, the key decisions are made right at the top. In other words, by the most senior managers. So centralised decision making has decision making at the top of the organisational hierarchy. So, for example, if you had a simple board, regional and area structure like this, with the levels of hierarchy illustrated, it would be the board that made the key decisions, and it would be for the regions and the areas reporting to the regions to implement those centralised decisions. Now, centralised decision making happens to a large extent in many businesses. Great examples being those businesses that are operating in multi-location markets, but a great example being the fast food industry and the franchise industry, where, to the extent that the owners of the business and the board own the operations of the business, it's absolutely vital that a consistent level of customer experience and quality, a consistent approach to processes, are followed throughout a business that could number several thousand different outlets. And so the fast food chains are good examples of centralisation over much of their decision making. And of course, one benefit of that is that you potentially get some savings, some economies of scale, because you're avoiding duplication of roles elsewhere within the organisation and the hierarchy, and you're sharing the cost of the centralised decision making team. Now, there are several potential business benefits of centralisation, and I've listed them here on the screen, which obviously you can pause at any stage and read for yourself. Let's just pick out a couple of these to see why a business might want to implement a centralised approach. We've already mentioned the economies of scale. In other words, if you've got a central marketing team, they're making the core decisions for the brand. Those decisions are passed down through the hierarchy, maybe across multiple outlets, rather than each individual outlet making its own marketing decisions. There's also an argument that centralised decision making can be quicker, which in some circumstances might be quite important. The decisions made by the board, that's it. It needs to be implemented. There's no debate. And there's also an argument that centralisation enables the implementation of consistent and common policies and practices across a business. And this is a particular issue in a multi-location business, where you want to ensure that the same procedures, the same practices are followed by all of them. So there are some potential benefits of centralisation, but as you might imagine, as with all things in business, there are also some downsides. So let's just look at some of these. The obvious one is that the centralised approach encourages the formation of layers in the hierarchy, where authority and decisions are simply passed down through the levels. Therefore, a hierarchy with more layers in it almost inevitably has higher costs, We know that, don't we, when we look at delayering as a way of reducing the costs of employing people and management. So if centralisation does lead to more layers in the hierarchy, you can therefore link centralisation to a higher cost operation. There's also quite a useful link between the centralised approach and the impact it has on people further down the hierarchy. So junior managers, for example, if they don't feel as though they have any responsibility and decision-making power, they may feel demotivated. That might be a demotivator so far as they're concerned in their job role. They may feel as though the organisation doesn't trust them to make decisions. And of course, from a customer point of view, centralisation can be a drawback. We've often heard it said, haven't we, about customers who are frustrated at their inability to get decisions out of head offices, out of senior teams, when in fact it would have been a lot easier for somebody local to the customer on the shop floor to make a decision and to leave the customer happy. So decentralised decision making is obviously the reverse of centralised, and the idea of decentralised is to try to spread out or share some, but not necessarily all, the authority and the decision making. So this isn't a question of it's either centralised or it's completely decentralised. There is a range of implementation that is possible. But generally, a decentralised structure tries to push as much decision-making out further down the hierarchy, down to the shop floor and down to junior managers as possible. So, for example, back to our organisational structure, whereas in centralised approaches, the board would pass down decisions. In a decentralised approach, you may have the regional approach, the regional managers or regional directors being given some authority, and they in turn may share some of that authority and decision making down to the areas, and maybe even down to a smaller or more detailed level than that. So decentralisation is spreading decision making down the organisational hierarchy. A great example of that, ever stay at a hotel, you may be staying at a chain like a Marriott or a Holiday Inn or a Premier Inn. The hotel staff usually are empowered and are enabled. They have the authority to make decisions on the spot. In particular, if you've got a customer service issue that needs handling, a problem or a complaint of some sort. And it's very hard to run a successful hotel chain unless you empower the staff and the junior management in the hotel to make decisions rather than always having to pass them back up to the head office or the centre. Therefore, you should be able to identify or perhaps guess what some of the likely business benefits are going to be of decentralisation. Now, of course, the benefits of decentralisation, by and large, are the reverse of the benefits of centralisation, but they can be significant. We've mentioned hotels and the ability of the junior manager or the concierge to make decisions that inevitably leads to an improved or maybe accepted level of customer service. If you can decentralise, it could be that you can remove some layers of the organisational hierarchy. A flatter hierarchy has fewer layers, which should result in lower costs. But I think more importantly, it also might result in more flexible decision makings. And I think also the fact that if you allow junior people, particularly those who are connected close to the customer, to make decisions, that should make them feel more empowered and also motivate them to do their job better. I'm sure there's a link between empowerment through decentralisation and staff motivation. Of course, there are potential drawbacks of decentralisation, particularly if it's taken too far. So, for example, you don't want the junior managers or the shop floor staff making strategic decisions. That's definitely a job for the board. And there's also a risk the more you push decisions down the hierarchy that you start to get some diseconomies of scale. All of a sudden, each region needs a marketing team or an HR team. Maybe each area needs an area manager to start taking decisions and start spreading the decision making. So you have to be careful with decentralisation that it's not adding cost into the business. And I think the final one, just to mention there, is where is centralised decision making most valuable? It's often the case it's particularly valuable when the business is in trouble, when strong leadership is needed, And the last thing you want are lots of other people within the organisation taking decisions. Well, actually, what you really want is for the CEO to make the decisions and for the rest of the business to be organised to execute on that strategy. And we've seen this when we look at the role of new CEOs in trying to implement change. It's quite hard if decision making has been widely decentralised. So what we've done there is just briefly introduce the concept of centralisation and decentralisation. It's a useful distinction and certainly relevant when you're looking at the efficiency of decision making in a business and the appropriateness of the organisational structure.